From the outside, the Bryan family looked perfect. A beautiful home, smiling children, and a husband everyone trusted. But behind closed doors, a terrifying secret was quietly destroying everything. Then, one cold November night, Emily Bryan and her 2 children vanished without a trace. As investigators searched for answers, they uncovered a web of lies, hidden debt, and a truth so disturbing it would leave an entire American town in shock. What really happened inside the Bryan home, and why did Brett Bryan believe he could hide it forever? The town of Ashton Ridge, Colorado, was the kind of quiet American suburb where neighbors waved from their driveways, children rode bicycles until sunset, and families gathered every Friday night for football games beneath bright stadium lights. It was peaceful, predictable, and safe, or at least that was what everyone believed. Among the most admired families in the community was the Bryan family. Brett Bryan was known as a calm, hard-working man in his late 30s who seemed devoted to his wife and children. He coached Little League games on weekends, attended neighborhood barbecues, and rarely missed a school event. His wife, Emily Bryan, was warm and friendly, often volunteering at community fundraisers and school activities. Together they appeared to represent the perfect American dream. Inside their 2-story suburban home, with its white porch railings and neatly trimmed lawn, the Bryans projected an image of happiness that nobody questioned. Friends described Brett as polite, organized, and dependable. He worked in regional sales for a construction supply company and frequently traveled for business meetings across neighboring states. Emily stayed busy managing the home and raising their 2 children, 12-year-old Caleb and 8-year-old Sophie. The children were well-mannered, bright, and deeply loved by everyone around them. To outsiders, there was nothing unusual about the family. They looked like the kind of family people trusted instantly. But behind closed doors, small cracks had quietly begun forming beneath the surface. Brett had become increasingly distant during the months leading up to the tragedy. He spent longer hours away from home and often locked himself inside his office late at night. Emily occasionally mentioned to close friends that her husband seemed stressed and distracted, though she brushed it off as work pressure. Financial concerns had also begun building in secret. Brett had made several risky decisions connected to personal investments and hidden debts that Emily knew little about. The pressure of maintaining their carefully crafted lifestyle was slowly becoming overwhelming. Neighbors later remembered subtle changes that seemed unimportant at the time. Brett stopped attending some local gatherings. He appeared exhausted and irritable during conversations. Sometimes he stared blankly during social events, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. Emily tried to maintain normal routines for the children, continuing family dinners and weekend outings, but close friends noticed tension in her voice whenever Brett's name came up. Even so, nobody imagined the situation could ever become dangerous. In communities like Ashton Ridge, terrible things were something people watched in documentaries, not something that happened next door. One cold November evening, the Bryan home went unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows while most families in the neighborhood settled in for the night. Around 9 p.m., a nearby resident noticed the Bryans' porch light flickering on and off several times. It seemed strange but harmless. Hours later, another neighbor reported hearing what sounded like a loud argument muffled through the walls, though no one could make out the words clearly. The sound stopped suddenly. By morning, the house stood completely silent. The next day, Emily failed to appear at a school volunteer meeting, something completely out of character for her. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Concern slowly spread among friends and relatives. When Brett finally responded later that afternoon, he claimed Emily had taken the children on a short trip after a family disagreement and needed space. His explanation sounded rushed, but there was no immediate reason for anyone to doubt him. Still, something about his behavior unsettled those who knew the family best. Over the following days, Brett attempted to continue normal routines, but the strain on him became impossible to hide. Witnesses later recalled that he looked pale and restless, often glancing over his shoulder during conversations. He avoided direct questions about where Emily and the children had gone. His stories became inconsistent. One moment he claimed they were visiting relatives. Another time, he suggested they needed time alone at a cabin outside the city. The explanations no longer matched. Meanwhile, investigators would later uncover a disturbing timeline hidden beneath Brett's carefully rehearsed words. Security cameras from nearby roads showed unusual late-night vehicle activity connected to the Bryan home. Phone records revealed frantic calls and deleted messages during the hours Emily and the children disappeared. Financial records exposed mounting debts, secret accounts, and personal problems Brett had desperately tried to conceal from everyone around him. The image of the perfect family man slowly began unraveling piece by piece. As pressure increased from worried relatives and suspicious neighbors, Brett's calm exterior started cracking. Reporters would later describe how his once confident demeanor transformed into visible panic. Yet even then, few people could comprehend the horrifying truth investigators were beginning to suspect. What initially appeared to be a missing family case was rapidly turning into something far darker, a devastating story of deception, fear, and a secret so destructive that it would ultimately destroy an entire family. And as detectives prepared to search deeper into Brett Bryan's hidden life, the quiet town of Ashton Ridge stood on the edge of a nightmare that would soon shock the entire nation. As concern over Emily and the children continued growing, the atmosphere in Ashton Ridge became tense and uneasy. Missing person flyers appeared across grocery stores, gas stations, and school bulletin boards. Volunteers organized neighborhood searches along wooded trails, nearby lakes, and abandoned service roads outside town. The Bryan family, once admired by everyone, had suddenly become the center of whispered conversations and constant speculation. Reporters gathered near the neighborhood entrance while police vehicles quietly moved in and out of the subdivision throughout the day. Still, Brett Bryan insisted there was a misunderstanding. He repeated the same calm explanation over and over. Emily needed time away after an argument, and she had taken the children with her voluntarily. But investigators were beginning to notice serious problems with his story. Detectives assigned to the case immediately focused on the timeline Brett provided. According to him, Emily left the home late at night with the children after a heated disagreement about finances and stress. However, surveillance footage from roads surrounding the neighborhood showed no sign of Emily's vehicle leaving the area during the hours Brett claimed. Even more troubling, Emily's phone activity stopped completely that same evening. Friends and relatives confirmed this behavior made no sense. Emily was known for staying in constant contact with family members, especially with her parents and closest friends. She would never disappear without speaking to someone first, especially while traveling with two young children. As investigators dug deeper into Brett's background, they discovered that the image he had spent years building was hiding a growing network of personal problems. Financial records revealed overdue payments, secret loans, and heavy debt connected to failed investment schemes Brett had concealed from his wife. Credit cards had been quietly maxed out over several years. Bank accounts showed unusual transfers of money into private accounts Emily reportedly knew nothing about. Behind the polished appearance of stability, Brett had been fighting a silent financial collapse that was rapidly spinning out of control. Former co-workers also began sharing details that painted a different picture of Brett than the devoted family man everyone thought they knew. Several employees described him as increasingly distracted and unpredictable during the previous year. He frequently disappeared during work hours, missed important meetings, and appeared exhausted during presentations. One co-worker later told investigators that Brett seemed constantly worried about losing everything. Another recalled hearing him complain privately about pressure at home and the fear that his carefully managed life was beginning to fall apart. The deeper detectives looked, the more they realized Brett had been living two completely separate lives. While maintaining the appearance of a loving husband and father in public, he had secretly become consumed by fear, debt, and desperation. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting Brett had made repeated attempts to hide financial documents from Emily. Email records showed she had recently started questioning missing money and unexplained charges. Friends later remembered Emily mentioning that she planned to sit down with Brett after the holidays to finally confront the growing problems between them. Detectives believe that conversation may have become the turning point that changed everything. Inside the Bryan home, investigators noticed several troubling details that contradicted Brett's version of events. Certain rooms appeared unusually cleaned, almost as if someone had tried too hard to remove signs of recent activity. A section of carpet in an upstairs hallway showed evidence of recent replacement. Cleaning supplies had been discarded in outdoor trash bins behind the property. Though none of these details alone proved anything, together they created an increasingly disturbing picture. The children's bedrooms were also left exactly as they had been days earlier. Sophie's favorite stuffed rabbit still rested neatly beside her pillow. Caleb's backpack remained packed for school near the front hallway. Detectives noted that no luggage appeared missing from the home despite Brett's claims that Emily had taken the children away for several days. Family members who visited the house became emotional after seeing how suddenly normal life seemed to have stopped inside those rooms. Meanwhile, Brett's behavior became more alarming under growing public attention. During interviews with investigators, he frequently changed details about the final evening he saw his family. At times he appeared overly rehearsed, carefully choosing every word. Other times he became defensive and irritated when questioned about finances or personal issues. Detectives noticed that he rarely asked about search efforts for Emily and the children, something they considered unusual for a worried husband and father. As media coverage intensified, the case began spreading beyond Colorado into national headlines. Television networks described the Bryans as a missing suburban family mystery, while online discussions exploded with theories and speculation. Many people still hoped Emily and the children would eventually be found safe somewhere far away. But investigators privately feared something far more tragic had occurred inside the quiet suburban home. Then came the discovery that changed the entire investigation. Late one evening, forensic teams examining electronic data recovered deleted location records connected to Brett's vehicle from the night his family vanished. The data pointed toward a remote wooded area nearly 40 miles outside Ashton Ridge near an isolated construction site rarely visited after dark. When detectives searched the location, they discovered signs of recent disturbance near a narrow clearing hidden behind dense trees. The atmosphere at the scene immediately shifted from cautious hope to growing horror. Authorities sealed off the area while forensic investigators worked through the night beneath floodlights and freezing temperatures. News helicopters circled overhead as rumors spread rapidly across the state. Back in Ashton Ridge, neighbors stood silently outside their homes watching flashing police lights on television broadcasts, unable to comprehend how the family they once admired had become connected to something so devastating. By sunrise, investigators had uncovered evidence confirming their worst fears. Though officials initially withheld details from the public, detectives now believed the disappearance of Emily and the children had not been voluntary at all. The carefully constructed story Brett Bryan had repeated for days was collapsing completely. And as investigators prepared to confront Brett with the growing evidence against him, the shocking truth behind the Bryan family tragedy was finally beginning to emerge. By the time investigators returned from the remote clearing outside Ashton Ridge, the entire atmosphere surrounding the case had changed. Detectives who once approached the investigation as a possible missing family situation were now working with a far darker understanding of what had likely happened. Though authorities carefully withheld many details from the public, the evidence recovered from the isolated site strongly suggested that Emily Bryan and her children had never left voluntarily. The story Brett Bryan had repeated for days was rapidly falling apart under mounting forensic evidence, digital records, and witness statements. Inside police headquarters, investigators spent hours reconstructing Brett's movements during the final night his family was seen alive. Traffic cameras, phone data, fuel purchases, and electronic records created a timeline that directly contradicted nearly every explanation Brett had given. According to investigators, Brett's vehicle traveled far outside his normal routine during the late-night hours after neighbors reported hearing arguments inside the Bryan home. Records showed unusual stops, long periods of inactivity in remote areas, and attempts to disable location tracking shortly afterward. Detectives later stated that the movements appeared organized and deliberate rather than accidental or impulsive. As pressure intensified, Brett agreed to another formal interview with investigators. What began as a calm conversation slowly became tense and confrontational. Detectives carefully presented inconsistencies in his statements one by one. They questioned why Emily's phone had stopped moving hours before he claimed she left the home. They confronted him about financial records, deleted messages, and surveillance footage showing no sign of Emily or the children departing the neighborhood. Witnesses later described Brett as visibly shaken, as investigators revealed how much evidence had already been uncovered. For hours, Brett continued denying involvement. He insisted Emily had become emotionally overwhelmed by financial stress and left without warning. But investigators noticed his explanations becoming increasingly confused and contradictory. At certain moments he appeared exhausted, staring silently at the table for long stretches before answering simple questions. Detectives believed the carefully controlled image he had maintained for years was finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. Meanwhile, the quiet town of Ashton Ridge struggled to process the growing horror unfolding around them. Families who once invited the Bryans to cookouts and school gatherings now watched national news broadcasts in disbelief. Parents held their children closer at school drop-offs. Neighbors avoided speaking loudly outside, as if the entire community had entered a state of shock. Emily's closest friends gathered at vigils holding candles and photographs, praying for answers while fearing the worst. Teachers at Caleb and Sophie's school described heartbreaking scenes as classmates left handwritten notes and flowers near the family's front yard. Investigators soon uncovered what they believed was the central motive behind the tragedy. Brett's hidden financial collapse had become impossible to contain. He was facing overwhelming debt, possible professional exposure, and the loss of nearly everything he had spent years pretending to control. Detectives discovered Emily had recently begun uncovering the seriousness of their situation. According to friends, she had planned to confront Brett directly and potentially separate from him if he continued hiding information. Investigators believed Brett became consumed by panic at the thought of his carefully constructed image being destroyed publicly. What shocked investigators most was how ordinary Brett had appeared throughout the entire ordeal. Surveillance footage showed him calmly purchasing groceries, speaking casually with neighbors, and attending public gatherings while search teams looked for his missing family. Detectives later stated that the contrast between his outward behavior and the reality investigators uncovered became one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Forensic teams continued examining the Bryan home in the days that followed. Additional evidence recovered inside the property strengthened the prosecution's case significantly. Specialists identified signs of attempted cleanup efforts and discovered traces indicating critical events had occurred inside the residence before Brett transported evidence away from the home. Combined with digital records and witness accounts, investigators believed they now had a complete reconstruction of the final hours before Emily and the children disappeared. Eventually, authorities publicly announced that the investigation had shifted into a homicide case. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. National media outlets interrupted programming to cover the story, describing it as one of the most devastating family tragedies in recent memory. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood for weeks while analysts attempted to understand how a seemingly ordinary suburban father could hide such darkness beneath a carefully polished public image. When Brett Bryan was formally charged, cameras captured him walking silently between officers with his head lowered, avoiding reporters shouting questions from behind barricades. The image spread rapidly across television broadcasts and newspapers nationwide. For many people, it became the moment the illusion finally shattered completely. The smiling father from family photographs and community events was now accused of destroying the very people who trusted him most. During court proceedings, prosecutors described a chilling pattern of deception, secrecy, and calculated behavior leading up to the tragedy. They argued Brett became trapped between maintaining his public image and facing the collapse of his private life. Rather than admitting failure or seeking help, investigators believed he chose a path that permanently devastated an entire family and traumatized an entire community. Emily Bryan was remembered during memorial services as a caring mother who dedicated her life to her children and community. Friends spoke emotionally about her kindness, patience, and devotion to family. Caleb was remembered for his love of baseball and science projects, while Sophie's teachers described her as energetic, creative, and endlessly cheerful. Thousands of people across the country followed the case and expressed heartbreak over the loss of a family that once appeared so full of hope and happiness. Even years later, the case of Brett Bryan continued haunting the town of Ashton Ridge. Neighbors who once trusted him admitted they still struggle to understand how someone could hide such overwhelming desperation behind smiles, conversations, and everyday routines. The Bryan home eventually stood empty for a long time, becoming a painful reminder of how appearances can sometimes conceal unimaginable truths. And for many people who followed the case, one question never fully disappeared: how many warning signs exist quietly behind closed doors long before anyone realizes a tragedy is unfolding?